Hello. We are covering the American Civil War in the class of Mexican American history. We're doing it for context. We're doing it as a comparison with the War of Reform and the French intervention in Mexico. And we are doing it to give an indicator of what might have been the agenda of elites, the cultural milieu of 19th century Americans when it came to race relations. So, for those reasons and more, I felt like doing the Civil War and Reconstruction was indeed relevant to Mexican American history. So, on the first one, right, what we're doing is we're doing the thesis that we really did have a crisis of conscience and it's court history, right? Is that we dropped the ball at the Constitutional Convention regarding universal enfranchisement or giving citizenship to everyone and really living up to the notion of natural rights for all human beings. We dropped the ball with slavery. We dropped the ball with black codes. We dropped the ball with treatment of Native Americans. And we dropped the ball with treatment of women, just for starters. So at any rate, now the next best thing is, right, is we finally get an exceptional generation that is conscience stricken and wants to rectify those wrongs, at least some of them, as pertinent to slavery and as pertinent to limitedly African American men. So at any rate, why now, according to this thesis? Well, for one, right, you kind of get psychology and sociology involved in the interpretations of history and contending that this was a time of great flux, a great change. It was the market revolution. It was the beginnings of an industrial revolution, a infrastructure development, and so urbanization, mass immigration, particularly of Irish and German immigrants. And so there were quite some changes going on. And in the midst of that flux, Americans were looking for answers with by way of a second great awakening, transcendentalism, reform movements, utopian movements, etc., in this antebellum period between the 1830s and the Civil War of 1861. So at any rate, you have people who have that thesis that this was an exceptional generation. They were looking for answers. They did not defer to tradition and authority. They were quite rebellious in that way, and especially the transcendentalists, in saying that we need to look for answers ourselves and not rely upon what historical institutions and traditions have told us to believe and take for granted. So they question things, right? And different axioms that hadn't been questioned in a while. And one of those axioms that was taken for granted prior to this generation was that you don't bring up slavery. If you do, you don't bring it up as an immoral institution, as an immoral practice, but you merely talk about its future, its profitability, its congruence with a capitalist economy and so forth. But you don't take it on as a moral issue, and they did. All right. So, do you have examples of kind of an exceptionally idealistic generation in the 1830s? People trying to change and improve the world? I would say yes. I would say there is data to support this very um, argumentative, subjective thesis. So for one, right, you have, as I mentioned, the reformers. The reformers were concerned with the burgeoning cities issues and countries issues like domestic abuse and alcoholism, exploitation at the workplace, um, physical health and nutrition. You had Sylvester Graham and others try to come forth with these blueprints for having a more healthy lifestyle. You had prison reform. You had public school systems with Horace Mann and others really gain ground at this time. Um, you also had an attachment to the intellectual movements in Europe, namely Romanticism. And Romanticism was kind of an anti-Enlightenment, anti um, harsh rationalism, more toward emotions, the macabre, the dark, the mysterious, etc. So we had Edgar Allan Poe and these other writers, right, that ran with that. And like I mentioned before, you had the Transcendentalists, and the Transcendentalists they wanted to transcend uh, their um, their superficial 9 to 5, and of course it wasn't literally 9 to 5 hours. I'm using a euphemism for today, but the typical 9 to 5 5 day work week, right? Just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round, said John Lennon. I just like to watch them go. They wanted to transcend beyond their mere material existence. And so they tried to put forth a kind of a formula for realizing one's purpose in life. Kind of like later on the beatniks. There was a certain amount of self-reflection, communion with nature, physical intimacy, social interaction, um, uh, charitable works, um, solitude, sleep, nutritional diet, etc. They kind of put it into a formula for people to transcend their material existence. And so you did have some idealism at this time for sure. And then, of course, you had the lyceums. The lyceums were intellectual fairs, and people would come to see experts in a myriad of fields. And there they could also see the abolitionists. And the abolitionists, right, were seen as radical because, for one, they took on slavery as a moral or immoral issue, right? Immoral practice and institution. And they weren't afraid to do such. They did not care about the complexities of the Constitution. As you see in the Constitution, when they talk about representation in the House of Reps, they mention 3/5 of people, which included alluded to slaves. You have a fugitive slave clause found in the original Constitution, and then you have the fact that the franchise, or who is considered a citizen and who is not, has been rendered to the states to decide for themselves. They really dropped the ball on that one. And so, when you look at all that, people would say that, like Abraham Lincoln and Henry Clay would say that, okay, I have a personal aversion to slavery, but the Constitution, it's it's permitted in the Constitution. So it's complex issue. We can't just do away with it. And if we do, how do we do such constitutionally? To the abolitionists, they didn't care. They wanted it immediately abolished because it was immoral. All right. And so they weren't for giving big concessions to the planter faction of the South in return for taking away their slaves. They weren't for measures of meeting them halfway, like something tantamount to eminent domain, pay the price of every slave to the planter, so he's reimbursed for investment in his quote chattel property. They didn't care about any of those issues. They just said it's black and white, it's immoral, it needs to be done away with immediately, legally. And then also some of the abolitionists went further than that. And they said, okay, well, you have like the Netherlands, you have Rome, where you have different levels of citizenship. Well, what level, if any, do we give to the black slave men once they're freed? Do we allow them just political protection under the law so that all legal infractions pertain to them as well, and they could take someone to court and defend their rights, their civic rights? Do we go a step further and add suffrage, allow them to participate in politics, to vote, to run for office, etc.? And then lastly, you might say, is the social or cultural realm. Do we allow the black people in America to intermarry and live amongst and with white Americans? So you had a whole spectrum that you could be in one spot or another therein. But with this spectrum, the abolitionists were seen as the most radical of the population. Okay. And so they had the cylindrical rotary press, or the beginnings of the penny press, the steam engine powered um, printing technology. They had the lyceums, as I mentioned. And so they had a way of making a lot of noise disproportionate to their small numbers. All right. And so they printed pamphlets. They printed emotional, sentimental novels, right? Like Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Abraham Lincoln did. He met the writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin and told Harriet Beecher Stowe, "So you're the little woman who started this war." That's how much credit he gave to her book. So at any rate, they made a lot of noise. They rocked the boat. And then the equivalent to them, because a lot of them were for moral persuasion, right? Uh, William Lloyd Garrison, of course, Frederick Douglass, Elijah Lovejoy, and others. But they had their political counterparts who were politicians and acted like radical Republicans within the political system, within Congress in particular. So you had a guy that I wasn't aware of until I had done some reading on the topic of the abolitionist movement and what were known as the radical Republicans. Because see, the Republicans, right? They really ran in the 1850s, especially in 60, right, with Abraham Lincoln. They ran with the idea of that they are for the self-made man, and they believe that an open economic system with wages and incentives to work hard are not only fair and American, but they are the most effective systems in bringing out the best in your workers, right? Only when a man knows that he stands to profit from his hard work will he work hard. So, therefore, to the Republicans, right, slavery was an anachronism. It was from the old school way of doing things. There was no incentive, obviously, for slaves to work hard. So, slavery was an anachronistic, old school, inefficient economic institution. And so, at any rate, you have that, right? And so to them, they wanted to offer jobs to mainly white men that would get wages for their jobs, would have a chance to move up the socioeconomic ladder at their jobs, and so forth. They were for free labor. So it was almost as if they were indirectly against slavery and the spread of slavery to the new Western states. All right. But the radical Republicans, they were more like the abolitionists. They said that slavery is immoral. It needs to be done away with as soon as possible. There needs to be at least limited citizenship rights for African American men. There needs to be even a degree of social integration between the black and white American people, etc. And so with the radical Republicans, they really stood out for not only their stance, right? Not only their speeches in Congress, in both houses of Congress, but also the manner by which they were uncompromising. Because remember, the word for the early 1800s, when it came to slavery, was basically not rocking the boat. It was the elephant in the room that everyone was aware of, and you just didn't go there unless it was in the spirit of cooperation and compromise. But no longer, okay? Charles Sumner, Henry Wilson, John Andrew, John Hale, Charles Francis Adams, Thaddeus Stevens, David Wilmot, okay? But one that I have read recently on and was very uncompromising, very bold, very confrontational was Salmon, spelled like the fish, Salmon Chase. He was something else. And so you also had Benjamin Wade, Joshua Giddings, Owen Lovejoy, etc. Okay, William Seward. So these guys were not your average run-of-the-mill politicians. These guys made a lot of noise. So, for instance, right, they would tell the moderate Republicans, if you don't take a stronger stance against the spread of slavery at the very least, or even slavery where it already exists, then we're not going to vote with you for protective tariffs for your favorite factions of textile manufacturers and metallurgical companies and corporations and money lenders, etc., right? Because the Republican Party was tied to big business very early on in the mid 1850s. So at any rate, they rock the boat, okay, and they create an image of this new radical generation of reformers who were no longer willing to compromise with the South, right? But are much more demanding, much more confrontational, etc. And so this helps rock the boat to start a fight that needed to be fought, right, in the form of the Civil War. So to whatever extent this is true, right, we could look over and say, okay, just we know in the 1830s and 20s, right, uh, in certain regions, there's no one homogeneous America, right? You have the deep South, you have the upper South, where tobacco and other things are going kaput, and their cash crop farming is not going as planned. The deep South are parvenus, they're nouveau riche, uh, self-made men. I say self-made men with a smile because they're not doing the labor, right? They're having slaves do the labor. So there was a new a revivifying effect of slavery in the Deep South of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. The price of slaves went down, the availability of slaves went up. Virginia, Maryland, and the Upper South began selling their slaves in mass down into the Deep South. Cotton became a highly coveted commodity because textiles were the number one industry in the country. And so they needed that cotton. And so hence these parvenus were saying cotton is king. We've got a taste of the good life and we're not going to let go of it. You have the Ohio Valley. These people, right, have had people move at the end of the War of 1812 from the South to receive free or cheap land in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Okay. And so the idea is, right, is you could take the Southerner out of the South, but you can't take the South out of the Southerner necessarily. And so they brought their racial prejudices with them up into the North, into the Ohio Valley. Nevertheless, a lot of them maintained a sense of patriotism and also a sense of um, anti-libertarianism, where they were not just like the South, just absolutely distrustful of the federal government, wanting the states and localities to keep their autonomy completely, etc. So they had other reasons besides wanting to fight for slaves to join the Union in the Civil War out of what they saw as loyalty and patriotism to their country. In the Northeast, yeah, you had more of an old traditional abode of abolitionists and radical Republicans, especially in the New England states, right? Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, etc. And so you had some of your hardcore zealots in that area, right? And also traditionally in New England, they had again a kind of a bigger government tolerance than in the libertarian South. So there are a lot of reasons why you would join the North or the Union, the country, in the 1861 Civil War, or why you might fight in the rebellion. And there's a book called Johnny Reb, and they asked these rebels from the South, right, these Confederates from the 11 states that tried to leave the country, leave the Union in secession. They said, "Why are you fighting for a rich man to keep his slaves?" They said, "Oh, we're not fighting for that. We're fighting for Alabama to decide for herself what to do with slaves. not these well-connected senators from Massachusetts. What do they know about our institution down here? They need to keep their nose out of it. So some were just libertarian in joining the rebellion. And as I mentioned, some were just simply patriotic in joining the Union. And certainly not because they were willing to die to free a single slave. Okay, much or much more, or much less die for all the slaves to be freed. So it was clearly more complex than that. We know that, right? For one, only 5 states of the 19 northern states, only 5 of them gave some citizenship rights to some black men. Period. That's it. And so there were 3 referendums during the war. 2 of them were in the Ohio Valley, and the other one was in the Northeast. And they had popular referendum or vote on granting citizenship, basic citizenship, political protections to black men. And in 2 of the 3 referendums, it failed. It failed to pass. So much for just like this united northern 19 state coalition that was radically wanting to end the immoral institution of slavery. That there's just too much data that flies in the face of that. But is there and might there be some truth to number one? Yeah, absolutely. I subjectively think. You have plenty of idealistic people that stood out prior to and during the Civil War. You had a growing sense also throughout the war. It's a 4-year war, and there was kind of a growing sense of like, okay, we're coming up on, 300,000 Yankees giving their lives to this cause. Why did they die? For what? For what end? Right? And so by the time of the Gettysburg Address, there was kind of a popular mandate to have some type of big, grand reason for the war, as opposed to just not allowing 11 states in the South to leave, right? So you find that in the Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln says, right, 7 years ago, our founding fathers brought forth on this continent an enlightened republic dedicated to the proposition and conceived in the notion of liberty and in the equality of men. And we are fighting to make sure that that special enlightened republic that was born and conceived on the notion that all men are created equal, if that type of special republic can last without splitting apart. So that's good court history, right? Saying that we were fighting for a noble cause, at least by this time, as we were looking for a deeper cause. And then finally, right after the Gettysburg Address, you're going to have the Emancipation Proclamation. You're going to use the employment of slaves as soldiers, and that's going to help things out to win the war. Psychologically, seeing ex-slaves wearing blue uniforms and guns marching down the Mississippi is going to frighten said Republican leaders, the South into submission. But it's also just going to be, every trained fighter matters in a war of attrition as to who could outlast whom, and it's going to help them win the tide, turn the tide of the war and win, starting in April of 1862, arguably. So at any rate, you see that there was a usefulness, there was a utility in freeing the slaves and using them as soldiers that Howard Zinn and other people report to and say, see, there were lots of different Americas, lots of different factions with their own agendas, and no one was truly, um, hyper focused on freeing the slaves other than the slaves and the free, quote, Negroes themselves. That eventually freeing and employing the slaves as soldiers became useful and giving a sense of purpose to the fight and helping win the war. All right. So at any rate, let's see here. So there's some truth, arguably, to this argument, but yet it does seem to simplify things too much. So then you have revisionist history that I've already kind of mentioned. Notice, right? The radical Republicans and abolitionists constituted only about 2.5% of the population. This is a tiny numerical minority that's fighting this crusade, right? Um, you had a draft riot in New York, and people went after black orphanages and other places, contending we are not going to die for the N-words. So, and that's in New York, in cosmopolitan, right? Diverse New York. So, yeah, so you have those things to think about as well. Also, when they began freeing the slaves, they did it in steps, and they began initially calling them contraband, right? Property that was confiscated from rebels, and so hence they could duly take them from them. So it was very punitive in nature. When you look at some of the first Northern Yankee military leaders, like Benjamin Butler, who began freeing the slaves everywhere they went, they virtually enslaved them again and made them cook and clean and bury the dead and do other disagreeable jobs. And clearly were annoyed by them, happened to feed them and take mind of them and slowing down their marches, etc. It just didn't seem like the humanitarian concerns were very high amongst leaders of the military. But then later on, right, you have some more radical things happen, like Field Order number 15. They took land from Confederate leaders and they tried to grant 40 acres and a mule to every freedman or ex-slave family in certain regions of the South. But even that, right? There's a gentleman who has a famous thesis that says that the Northern, especially military leaders, were not doing it out of humanitarian sentiment, but they were doing it vindictively to crush and punish the white South. That they did what they did for black people to spite the white South, not to truly, genuinely help the black people. Right. And so, regardless of what the war was being fought over, and regardless of what the intentions of Lincoln were, and I say that last part because Lincoln gets killed, right? And so he can't participate in Reconstruction. And so we'll never know, like, to what extent he would have shown himself to be a true radical Republican by this time. But to whatever extent that he was and that he meant well, I think the argument goes that the very best narrative you could put together using the facts is one of evolution. That Lincoln certainly did not start off as anything that even resembled an abolitionist or a radical Republican, but that in time he slowly evolved in taking a stronger and stronger stance against slavery and taking and becoming more and more enlightened in wanting African Americans to not only be freed, but to have the rights of citizenship at the very least. All right. So at any rate, we'll never know because, of course, he's assassinated. But if you wanted to take a look at some of these quotes, what he says, you definitely get, the Lincoln that we love to hear about in elementary school, a sentimental side to him, whereby he fights against the Southern rationale for keeping slaves, the Southern rationale for alleged Negro inferiority, things that we'd like to see from a president today. Um, so anyway, he's assassinated. And so then we're left with uh, the um, the period of Reconstruction. All right, so the federal government's zeal to change the South waned, right, or diminished when the going got tough. So the argument is we had a backward president named Andrew Johnson, and he has such um, a stubborn pro-South, anti-big government, anti social justice agenda for the South at the end of the Civil War, that to a lot of people, all they simply had to do to fight against him politically was to, quote, wave the bloody shirt, was to remind Americans of how many Yankees had given their lives in this Civil War. And what was it for? For nothing? So that the South changed virtually nothing? Because that's what happened initially at the end of the Civil War, is the president, Andrew Johnson, tries to take over the policies of Reconstruction, and he allows the Southern leaders to reclaim their positions of power and allows them to circumvent or go around um, the 13th Amendment of abolishing slavery and so forth. So, yeah, when you look at that, it looks terrible. He has speeches where he uses the N word and says the South needs to be left alone. They've suffered enough. Let them do what they want with their own state policies, etc. Well, that's not going to work, right? People are going to wave the bloody shirt, say that we fought and our boys died for nothing. There's going to be no changes enacted in the South, it appears. And so the radical Republicans are going to win a big congressional election in 1866, and they're going to garner a supermajority in one, if not both, of the congressional houses. So now, right, they could override any of the president's vetoes with a two-thirds majority. And so now they're not playing around. And they do get punitive as well as argumentatively idealistic. So, for instance, right, if you had pledged to follow the Constitution and the federal government, and then you had subsequently broken that pledge by joining the rebellion, you were stripped of your citizenship rights for 2 years. Okay. And who had given such a pledge? Politicians, military officers, people who were considered the cream of the crop of the white South. Now they're without citizenship for 2 years. Such was the kind of punitive approach. They kept troops down into the South and kept the South occupied by troops, including black troops, which of course the white South took exception to. They issued the 14th Amendment and the 15th, stating that anyone simply born or naturalized in any of the states was entitled to all the rights, privileges, and protections of citizenship. The 15th said anybody who wishes to participate, suffrage, right, participate in politics by voting and running for office, etc., that is covered under the rights, protections, and privileges of citizenship. And so they make that clear in the 15th Amendment. And so some of them had ironclad oaths when they met as new state conventions to be re-extended statehood status by the federal government because the 11 states had left. So they had to start over and reapply, have a constitutional convention, write a new state constitution that put an end to slavery and recognized the 14th and 15th Amendments as well. And, they had to do that in order to be re-entered as a state and be given, the economic, mainly, uh, uh, opportunities and privileges that come with that. So at any rate, in South Carolina, de facto, by disenfranchising those who had given an oath of allegiance to the Constitution and then had subsequently broken it, um, in addition to adding the ironclad oath, and that was in some cases if you had simply joined or helped financially or militarily in the rebellion, again, for a limited time, up to 2 years, you were stripped of your citizenship rights. All right. And then also there was Article 2 or B of the 14th Amendment, and it stated that if you did not abide by allowing every male born or naturalized in any of the states to participate in politics, then you were to be stripped of your numbers of representatives and stripped of your opportunities for citizenship in your state. So at any rate, there were punitive ways that the Northern Republicans dealt with the South now. They were not playing around. And so in states like South Carolina, the African American men became the majority of citizens and elected a majority of state assemblymen who were black, many of whom had been ex-slaves. We know nothing of this, you guys, prior to this generation. Prior to 1868, name a time in which you have a high demographic number of ex-slaves, plantation slaves, who are now politicians in their home states. It was just amazing. So there were 16 congressmen that were elected that were black. There were well over 500 state assemblymen who were elected that were black. Two lieutenant governors, two senators, etc. If you're interested, like in some of the black leaders, look up Blanche K. Bruce, look up Hiram Revels, look up Robert Smalls, look up Francis Cardoso, some guys who developed quite a reputation for integrity, for courage in demanding certain rights for the black men in their states, etc. So this happens, right? For a short period of time, it's like everything has become topsy-turvy. Uh, and in one case, right there, toward the end of the war, there was an African slave, an ex-slave, who got to capture his master in battle. And he tells him, "Well, sir, it looks like the bottom rail is up this time." And they use that in the textbook sometimes to illustrate around 1868 when everything turned 180 degrees and black men were in charge in many instances and offices throughout the South, okay, as politicians. The hated triumvirate were freedmen, as we have talked about, the black ex-slaves. Also, white Northern Republicans who moved down in large numbers into the war-torn South, and they were seen by the white population by and large as parasites, wanting to feed and enrich themselves off the misery of the war-torn South, and they were called carpetbaggers. And then you also had white Republicans in the South. I mean, that took some guts to join the Republican anti-slavery party as a white man living in the South. And they were known as scalawags. So they were known as the hated triumvirate, the hated group of three that took over for a while around 1868 to 1870, the South and its reconstruction um, away from slavery, away from the black codes, away from uber libertarianism, and back into statehood status of the Union. But initially, right, time passes and the time passes and those who had been disenfranchised for 2 years, their 2 years passed. So now they're given citizenship rights again. They could run for office as old ex-Confederate leaders. They had not been officially tried of a crime. Lincoln toyed with the idea of calling them rebels and calling this an insurrection. But when it came to issues like trading prisoners of war, it didn't work out for him to get his prisoners of war back. So he gave in and conceded to the notion that the South temporarily had become a separate country that he was fighting against. And so now that the people are reenfranchised as old Confederate leaders, they weren't technically charged of a crime, so they could become leaders once again. You had the Ku Klux Klan, the Brothers of White Camellia, and other orders that were for white suppression of black Americans, of Roman Catholics, of immigrants, of homosexuals, of deviants in their eyes, et cetera, et cetera. And so they say that 1 to 2 out of 5 African Americans that try to go to the polls to vote on election day was physically attacked. I'm surprised it wasn't even higher than that. A lot of my stats that I'm getting come from Eric Foner, Foner, one of the most well-known historians of the Civil War and Reconstruction. All right. So at any rate, the Southern politicians, they brought about some changes. They brought about the end of the oligarchic rule of the old antebellum planter class, right, of slave owners. They never had the same power. They never wielded the same degree of power again. For one, they had kind of had a monopoly on education. That is going to change with public schools. Then a monopoly on credit or providing loans to would-be businessmen and cash crop farmers. That changes as they bring more sophisticated credit systems and bankers and lenders from the North and from Europe coming down into the South. Monoculture, just South Carolina relying upon rice and indigo, Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia relying upon cotton, Virginia relying upon tobacco. They're going to diversify at this time under these new black governments, these new triumvirate governments. That's going to change as well. And so there was some progress that was made for sure. But the problem is, right, is a lot of them spent themselves into debt. The press is going to run and call it Negro misrule, and they're going to highlight a few instances of black politicians being corrupt and engaging in corrupt practices. And they're going to uh, paint it with a huge, broad paintbrush against all black politicians. Um, and then the black and white Republicans in the South, the white Republicans kind of bailed on the black ones and said, we'll be more responsible with our money. We'll be more responsible against corruption. Just vote for us. And they separated themselves from the black Republicans. And when they were split in half like that, the Democrats saw their chance to come back in the white South, and they did. And not to mention, the period of Reconstruction was from 1865 to 1877. 12 years is a long time to hold the nation's utmost attention. So you had drama with the Native American tribes in the West. You had drama with the robber barons and industrial revolution. All kinds of other things were grabbing the attention of Americans so that they were losing interest in what was going on in the war-torn South. So at any rate, you have a president who cuts a deal. No one got a majority of electoral points, but someone got a plurality, got the most points, but you have to have 50% plus one. And if not, the two candidates with the highest electoral points are sent to the House, and the House decides between the two. And when they did, Rutherford B. Hayes from Indiana, I believe, somewhere in the Ohio Valley, Rutherford B. Hayes promised the Southern House reps that if they chose him as the next president, he would evacuate the South. Uh, he would evacuate the troops from the South and let the Southern states do their own thing. That was known as the Compromise of 1877. So things, right? Things got better from 1868 to 1870. Black participation in government. There was a little bit of evidence, Foner says, of actual cultural habituation, where the black and white people in the South rubbed elbows at the same social places and so forth, and worked side by side in some cases. But it didn't last. It ultimately failed. And that's why later on with the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, they're going to call it the era of the second Reconstruction of the South, because the first era of Reconstruction had failed. All right. And then the last one is super brief on this one, okay, because it's so simplistic of a thesis, is I make the argument that you cannot apply political solutions for a social or cultural problem. Okay. You can pass any law you want. The 13th through 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 to 1868. They started very basic, saying that African Americans have the right to obtain a salary They have a right to rent and purchase property and sell property on their own. So basic economic rights, right? And then, like I said, the 14th and 15th Amendments make it clear that they could also participate in politics. Okay, great. But what about racial discrimination? What about the Sambo image of African Americans? That was not really challenged. And these political laws and amendments are not going to cut it. And getting people to stop using the N word and stop being hateful toward African Americans and fearful of them in the white South. So that's my simple thesis for number two, is you can't apply political solutions for a social or cultural uh, disease problem. Okay, so does anybody have any questions?
No questions.
All right, thank you, Maribel. All right, so let me make sure that I have your names so you guys will get your extra
No
credit.
question.
Yeah,
Oh, I said no question. My bad. Oh,
I'm sorry, Fernando.
I said no questions. I was just answering your question.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Okay. Well, let's see here. Maribel, let me get your apellido. Okay, so all right, great, you two. You guys will get your extra credit on this assignment, okay? So thank you for sticking it out with me. And if you don't have any other questions or any questions, I'm finally done.
Okay. Thank you. Have a
All
good
right,
day.
Thank
have a
you.
good day.
Have a good day.
Bye bye.
You
Thank you.
too, Fernando. Bye, you
Thank you.
guys.
Bye.
Bye bye.